So let's jump right back into Maisey Yates's book here on page 251. He was in a good place today, both physically and mentally. Spiritually, Sammy would probably say, not that he gave much thought to that kind of thing, but she made him consider it, because there was something to the connection the two of them had, and it was deeper than anything he could see. So maybe she was onto something after all. It was his favorite kind of day, out in the middle of the field, just having him move the cows from one pasture to another. The kind of day that reminded him of why being a rancher might have chosen him, and it might not have been where he imagined his life going, but he was happy with it. Yeah, maybe he would have gone to school, and he would have played football longer. His coach had been upset about his quitting, but about his not going on to college to play, but by now he would have done away with football. He had worked his land since he was 18 years old and cultivated the herd, and the animals changing as the years rolled on, the landscape staying the same as much. But there were slow changes that he could see, changes that he had forged his own hands, and changes that had been the result of nature pushing right back at him. He loved those losses as much as he loved the victories, because in the end, that's what reminded him that he was alive. He heard the sound of a truck engine and turned around, shocked to see Sammy driving across the field toward him in his sister's truck. That was unusual, to say the least. She parked and got out, all fluttering pale pink summer dress and wild blonde hair, and he had this irresistible image of laying her down in the grass and being with her underneath the sky. Of course, I'm skipping it over, kind of keeping it PG for all the little kiddies that might be watching. Yeah, that was what he wanted. And he moved quickly, closing the space between them, but stopped with one look and from those wide blue eyes. I have something to tell you, she said. What? He immediately struck by terror, because she looked afraid, and anything that scared Sammy struck him just as deep. I took a pregnancy test. It was just like a mountain all around the horizon had tipped in on themselves and crumbled, like the world had gone concave, leaving only the place that they were standing on. His boots were rooted to the ground, and that same ground that he worked all these years, that familiar, unchanging earth, and yet it was all new now. Everything was. It would never be the same again. It must have happened that first time, she said. I know when it would have happened, he said. Skip a little bit here, so keep it good for the kids. And he knew what would have to happen next, as sure as the sun would rise tomorrow, and that would be that his ranch would have done every day for the past 17 years. We're getting married, he said. Her face popped up, her hair swaying with the movement. No, she said. No, we don't have to do that. I mean, can't we just live here, live in this place, and I don't know, I can be in the camper, and you can sometimes be in the house, and sometimes we'll be together? Because it's not enough, he said. Why not? That's not how families work. It is how families work. It's how our family has been for the past 17 years. He gritted his teeth. We're not family, Sammy. She jerked as though he slapped her, as he hated that look of pain across her delicate face. No, of course not. I mean, not that way. I get it. That isn't what I meant. I just meant that we can be a family the way that my parents were a family. That's how it should work. I'm not going to do something like that just because that's how it should be. Why the hell not? Because believe me, marriage is not the answer to everything. I lived in a house with a horrible dysfunctional marriage, and they will not raise a child in an environment where two people are stuck together. Are you comparing us to your parents? It's just, look, I know how bad it can get. Are you scared of me? He asked. She looked horrified by the very thought. No, she said, I'm not afraid of you, but I'm afraid of what forever stuff does to people. I'm afraid of the misery that you'll expect because you signed a piece of paper, because you stood up and made vows in front of everybody, and that you said you would, and we are happy. We're happy like we are already. We are not going to stay like we are. There's going to be a baby, and there's changes going to be made. It changes a hell of a lot, Samantha. We just can't undo it. We can't undo it at all. But why not? She blinked furiously, the terror rolling off her and turning into something else that inside him. And it was one thing when she was afraid of something, and it wasn't him. He wanted to fight the battle for her. He wanted to fight every battle for her, but he didn't know what the hell to do when he seemed to be the battle. When she was looking at him, acting like his proposal of marriage was the worst thing that could possibly happen. Why can't we make it a new reality? That's what you did here, and all right, maybe you don't consider me part of the family, but I've already considered myself a part always considered myself a part of it. I wanted to be here so badly because I lived in that life and was supposed to be right. A mother, a father who were married, and I was miserable. Every day I had to apologize for being. And when I left there and came to you, I promised I wouldn't do that anymore, and I haven't. I got to grow up in the most amazing place in the world because of you, because you rescued my family, and because you were all the brave enough to make a family out of something else, to sew it together using leftover pieces, and I've always felt lucky enough to be one of those pieces. But we are not left over, he said, his voice rough. You and me were something real. We get to make a choice, Sammy, what we are and what we're going to be, what we want to be for our baby and for our baby. He had feared this moment all of his life, that he would get to this stage where he's finally free and he wouldn't be. But the reality was, if he didn't have Sammy with him, he wasn't all that free. If this child was out there in the world and he didn't have access to him, he wasn't all that free. It was a new version of freedom, that was for sure. But then he never felt more of himself when he was with Sammy. So being with her could never be a prison. I'm scared, she said. Of me? I'm not your father, he said, and his voice was rough. I know, she said. No, he said, you need to understand. Not just know in your head. You need to feel it in your heart. I am the man who would destroy someone for touching you like that, and anyone who would come after our baby. I would destroy him too. I will never hurt you, and will never hurt our child. He brought her close to him, put his hand on her stomach, and he felt a sense of awe wash over him, because they had created something between them. They had created a life, and he had experienced so much loss of life over the past 35 years to have there be a life created new because of them. It's a damn miracle, Samantha. The two of us made something like this. She looked up at him, fear and tears in those blue eyes. What if I'm a terrible mother? What if I'm a terrible wife? What if is broken by this? We will never be broken, he said. Didn't I promise you that? Yes, she said, but that doesn't mean I'm not afraid. He nodded slowly. I understand, but you can trust me. Marry me. Move in my house. Sleep in my bed. Be my family and make a family with me. He never seen those things going this way with Sammy, not all those years, but there was no other option. She was his, and his baby was his, and that meant that had to be this. Hell, that had been the case from the moment they first kissed, because the alternative was that they would go their separate ways, be with other people, continue on the way that they always done, occasionally hooking up with strangers in bars, making others sure that they ignored the heat between the two of them. So it had to be everything, because it could never be that. It was suddenly all he wanted, Sammy as his bride walking toward him in white again. Marry me, he said. It wasn't joy on her face, but it was fear. And it was more of a slow acceptance of what had to be, and it was. And there was no other route. She could see it too. All right, she said, I'll marry you. We can have normal, he said. He took her in his arms and held her. He didn't kiss her, even though he wanted to. He just held her there. We can be normal, he repeated. And there was a strange sort of giddy feeling that washed through him, because he never imagined that this moment would be for him, getting married, having a kid. It was right there. He could taste it. He wanted it. He found in that moment he really did. Okay, she said. It wasn't yes. But after a lifetime they both had, he would be damn well taking okay. Somehow she went, oh, wait a minute. Well, I'm engaged now, she came back to tell the friends. She was making her way purposely to the canning things. The reaction was deafening. I didn't think that was the whole point of your baby thing, Iris said. She sighed. This is the sort of separate from the baby thing. I mean, the initial endeavor. It's just something that happened. She looked at Rose, who was gazing at her with her eyes wide, and figured it was as good a time as any. So, I'm marrying your brother. The response was yet again deafening, but this time there was expletives. Is he the father? Pansy asked. Yes, Sammy said. Iris and Pansy were utterly agap. Rose was still. I don't know even how to approach that, Iris said. I thought the two of you were friends, but maybe that was a little bit naive of me to assume that you weren't. We weren't, Sammy said. I mean, not until the past couple of months. I knew you were acting weird, Iris said. That night at the saloon, I knew the two of you were being strange, and frankly, I knew you've been strange much of the time since. Well, we were, and it wasn't supposed to be this, but it is, so we care for each other. There's no reason in the world we can't make it work, and nothing much is really going to change, except I guess I'll be your sister somewhat legally. It was Rose who closed the distance between them and wrapped her arms around Sammy. "You're always my sister already," Rose said, "but I'm really glad that you're going to be my sister-in-law. It just seems delightfully official." "Yes," Sammy said, "it does seem official." "You don't like official?" Pansy said. "I don't really, but Ryder does, and I like him an awful lot." "Are you in love with him?" Pansy asked. That word struck a strange sort of terror into the center of Sammy's chest. "If there ever was such a thing as soulmates, I think he's mine. I think we knew each other before we met. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm sure it doesn't. We're whatever that is." "That's nice," Iris said far too mildly. "I don't know," Pansy said. "I think you should be in love with the person that you marry." "Just because that's how things work for you, Pansy, that doesn't mean that's how it works for everybody." "I know," Pansy said, "but Sammy, you're wonderful and you deserve everything." Sammy brushed her feelings off her and settled like an uncomfortable cloak. "Anyway, there can't be anyone else. Honestly, there never could be. They were all looking at her sadly, meaningfully, and so she twisted her lips into a strange sort of impish smile. "He's a dang genius in the bedroom." "No." Pansy threw her hands up and doubled over like she was retching, and Iris put her palm to her forehead. "He's ruined me for other men," Sammy said, nodding gravely to the underscore of the point. That was true, more than true. "Well, I'm happy for you," Pansy said, making a mock retching sound again. "Well, be fine," Sammy said. "Nothing's going to change, really. I mean, nothing has changed. Yep, there's a new dimension to our relationship." "I don't want to hear about my brother's dimensions," Rose said. "Oh, big, just so you know. But also, we care for each other. We care deeply. And that is so important, and that's what's going to see us through all these changes in life. Anyway, I can't imagine anything better than being here with all of you, and you being my baby's aunts." That did seem to make everybody happy and make them forgive her for what she said about his dimensions. And it gave her confidence to hope that whatever would happen from here would be all right. It had to be. There really wasn't any other option. Okay, this is a good paragraph here on page 266. "He was broken," Ryder said. "The reasons you can't love come from inside you." There was something hollow and empty in his voice, and it made her want to ask another question, but she feared the answer far too much, so she didn't ask. Instead, she kissed his forearm and rested herself more deeply against him. No good came from asking questions you didn't want to hear the answer to. She'd done her best to make a life where she didn't need to ask those kind of questions, and she didn't need to. She had him. He was committed to her, to taking care of her, to taking care of that baby, and there was no reason to ever ask for any more. No reason to hope for any more. She couldn't. And wouldn't. She would be all happier for it. She had his arms, and they would be protecting her. What more could she possibly need? The family picnic on the 4th of July was interesting this year. West and his half-brother Emmett made for a fascinating new addition. West was the subject of much interrogation from Colt and Jake, who had come back from the circuit for the event, but they could take a break for interrogating West just long enough to corner Ryder and shove a beer in his hand. "Getting married, huh?" Colt asked. "To Sammy," Jake added. "And having a baby," Logan added. "Are you congratulating me or accusing me of something?" Ryder asked. "Both," Jake said, looking at Colt, who nodded in agreement. "Definitely both." "Seriously?" "If you hurt her," Jake said, "we will tear you apart," Colt added. "Limb from limb," Jake finished, then took a swallow of beer. "I'm sorry," Ryder said. Have I stepped into an alternate dimension? I have been taking care of Sammy for the past 17 years, and I'll keep doing it now. She doesn't have a father who will threaten you. She doesn't have brothers to do it, so she has us." "I'm your brother, you idiots." "Technically our cousin," Colt said. "No relation," Logan said. "This is the thanks I get," he asked, "for taking care of you fools for all those years?" Colt shrugged. "Sammy's a nice woman." "I'm nice," Ryder said. Colt shook his head. "You're a lot of things, but nice isn't really one of them. Decent, good, but not nice." "Ungrateful idiots," Ryder grumbled. "See my point?" he said. "I'm taking responsibility," Ryder said, "doing what any good man would do." "Oh, I hope you use that in your proposal," Jake said. "The height of romance." "I didn't say it was romance. He and Sammy were deeper than that anyway. He didn't need to put labels on it. Wasn't Sammy the one who was so averse to putting labels anyway? It all made sense. It really did. There was no point to being a fool about it." He remembered what she had told him this morning in the early hours as he held her on the bathroom floor about how she asked her father why he didn't love her. What he had to say to her had been so true. People didn't not love you because of something wrong with you. It was always something wrong with them. And there was something with him. That was the thing. What he felt for Sammy was some kind of sickness and intensity that made it so he couldn't breathe, couldn't think clearly, not like the sweetness shared by the parents. Damn it all, he worried. He worried that what it would be like over the course of years for anyone to be in a house with him. He looked over at her and felt it bleeding. He felt love for his family, though it wasn't any easy thing, more like bonding that couldn't be undone, forged in the kind of fire that you could never walk through on purpose. He didn't have it in him to love, not the way that he watched his parents to do it. Theirs had been something wonderful, had brightened up the whole house, easy and companionable, and the kind of emotion he didn't think that he had the ability to feel. For him, the connections to people would always be double-edged, because the more you cared, the more you feared losing them. And yeah, having this baby was a miracle, but it was a burden too, because there was a burden to caring, to having something that small and vulnerable to be a responsibility. Yeah, it was something. But he was handling things the way he knew how to do it, taking control, taking ownership. It was what he did. It was how he made it better, how he made it work. We're happy for you, Colt said, but are you happy? Because Sammy deserves someone who thinks this is happy. She's got me, Ryder said, and somehow he felt like that was a metaphor for everyone's life that was here. And they had deserved something else. They had gotten him. Maybe he was supposed to have something else, but he'd gotten them. Not that he resented it, especially not Sammy, but because God knew there was nothing else, no one else but her. But it was just that. Well, maybe they all deserved to feel a whole lot differently, to love a whole lot more differently, to live a whole lot more differently. But they gotten parents and they lost them when they had. And in the end, they've been left with the things that they've been left with. Sammy had come to him because he was next door, not because she had an endless array of saviors to choose from, but because he was the only savior on hand. It was all well and good, but it wasn't the same as people who went through life with a support group you were meant to have, the parents that you were meant to have, the parents who lived, the parents who loved you, not parents who would just hit you and ask you where that love was. His blood burned, now that he knew that what Sammy had done, dared to ask of what should have been hers by birth. We did all right, Colt said. Yeah, Ryder said, you did okay. His relationship with these men had shifted over the years, but they were more like brothers now. But they had been something more than that to him for a long time. He had known that it was to be an older brother, and what did come with those feelings of a certain amount of responsibility. But it was also different when the school had to call, the grades were down, or when they got into a fight. It was different when you were the final word, or when you were the one that had to lay down the law of underage drinking, when you were still underage yourself. It was all just different. And he still didn't need them trying to throw down guilt trips about Sammy and what he could be to her and what he couldn't. He was well aware of his shortcomings, he was well aware. But he was offering her something, not nothing. And maybe it wasn't everything, because he didn't possess the ability to give a whole lot more than what he already offered, but he had offered what he had. That was going to have to be enough. Okay. We're going to go to page 276. I've got to check on the laundry. Then we'll do some of the magazine, and I'll probably finish up with some of the book tonight. We're on page 272. In the middle of all this familiarity, there was still something that stood out, bright and different, even though she was the same. Sammy was laughing, the dogs twirling around her, overexcited blurs of fur looking at her made his chest hurt. The sun shone down on her like she was an angel of some kind, like the light was finding its own gathering together, creating something so brilliant that he could hardly bear to look at straight on. Sammy. Something shifted inside him, something deep, and he couldn't find a name for it, except all of a sudden a whole bunch of truths tumbled into him. That in a couple of years he'd be watching his child run around at the very same barbecue, that he would be about his father's age when he died. It was such a strange milestone to move toward, a part of life that his dad hadn't got to even live. And he would be a father. The idea of his leaving his son behind, or his daughter, to face the kinds of things that Ryder and the rest of them had to face alone. The kid was barely bigger than a lima bean at this point, and he was already making him insane, making him think about things that just brought him to his knees. Damn it, this was tough stuff, and he couldn't quite find the words to say why. He never had to find the words for his particular pain. All he had to do was figure out how to shove it down and deal with it, because he was the oldest. So there was no one for him to talk to. He hoped that they would all talk to each other, that Colt and Jake had found ways to give their grief a language, that Iris, Pansy, and Rose had bonded with each other, and that he and Sammy, beautiful and bright, and he hadn't wanted to put any of this pain onto her. He only wanted to enjoy her particular brand of beauty, her particular brand of brightness. That had been everything he ever wanted. She saw him and smiled. "You look better," he said, moving close to the distance between them. "I feel better," she said, "but then this is a good time for me, and sometime in the early hours of my enjoyment of this barbecue will rebound on me. I feel like our child hates me already." "He doesn't hate you," Ryder said, not even sure why he was engaging in this strange line of conversation. I don't know," he said. "I'm just saying. You're talking like you know its emotions. Me knowing its gender seems weird." She laughed. "Not weirder, but maybe we're both a little bit weird." She shook her head. Is this what it does to you?" "I guess so," he said. "I don't have another frame of reference." There was a strange thread of awkwardness between them, and that was never the case for him and Sammy, because Sammy was never awkward, and he had never taken her for someone who held things back, but he could feel it now, feel himself doing it, and doing it in response could feel a strange thread of tension between them, and it wasn't just them, not them. But he had a feeling that getting rid of it would take sorting through some of the shifting that had happened inside him, and he didn't know how the heck to do that. Didn't even know if he wanted to either, and he was pretty dang sure that Sammy wouldn't want to anyway, because all he could do was think about the emotion in her voice when she had told him her story about her father. There had been so small amount of fear there. He never wanted to be the cause of the fear. The day wore on and faded into the evening, and he watched Colt and Jake set off the fireworks, come damn near close to blowing off their fingers, laughing like oversized teenage boys. Ryder was grateful they did laugh like that, and they had all come through everything like with a sense of adventure, that they had grown into themselves, gone off and joined the rodeo and all that. "What?" He looked over at Sammy, whose face was illuminated by golden pink of fireworks that were going off around them. "Nothing, just watching the show. And thinking so loud I can practically hear the gears in your head grinding." "I'm happy for them," Ryder said. "I'm happy that they went out and found their dream. What about you?" "I have more than I imagined I would," he said, but when Sammy smiled up, it seemed forced, and he didn't like that either, because Sammy didn't do forced, not usually. "You know, you can always find out if there's a coaching position available at the high school," she pointed out. "I don't need to coach," he said, a strange bruised feeling hitting his chest. "I'd be retired from the game by now anyway, even if I'd gone on to play for real, and I wouldn't have." "You don't know that." "I mean, I pretty much do." "Everything's going to be okay, right?" She was looking up to him hopefully, and problem was he knew that you couldn't make guarantees like that you couldn't just say that it would be fine because you didn't really know. But what he did know was that you could stay standing even when the dark stuff went down. He knew that you could withstand a heck of a lot more than you thought you might be able to. And you could take broken pieces and turn them into something, not necessarily something that was just as good as what you had, and not even something that would make it all okay, but you worked at it. If you tried, you were never left with nothing. He knew that much. "It's going to be," he said, I know. The sun always rises and sets, Sammy, no matter what's happening in other parts of the world, no matter what's happening in your life." "So you're telling me the world's not going to end, and that's all you can guarantee?" "That's about all any of us have. A great comfort. You know," he said, "it's not any different for anyone else, really. No one has any guarantees. It's just that you and I know it, and we know that sometimes life is not kind, and you've been born into the wrong family, and two parents who should never have had children." "That's awfully cheering," Sammy said. "I've always thought so." But as they sat there together like they'd always been, and different yet than they'd ever been, he had hoped that it really would be okay, because they weren't like anyone else, and they weren't like they had ever been before. He reached out and took Sammy's hand in his and brushed his thumb over her ring finger, which was bare, because she told him she didn't need a real wedding, and because she acted like rings and dresses would scare her away from the aisle. And it just felt wrong. He knew how to be friends with Sammy. He knew how to protect her. He had no real idea how to be a husband to her. And if he was going to promise her it would all be okay, he was going to have to figure out exactly what to do. Okay, well, while we're on this figuring out what to do, that's a good spot to take a time out, go check on the laundry, come back here in a minute, and do 2 more videos with you. So, taking a time out, but I will post this video before I go get the laundry and my other little doodads, so stay put.